Next on News Talk, AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show with Kevin Doran.
Brian O'Neill in again for Kevin Doran. It's Wednesday morning. Our usual Thursday guest, Dr. Christian Kopff, is on today. That's because Congressman Tom Reed will be on tomorrow. Our thanks to Dr. Kopff for coming on.
Good to be here.
Dr. Christian Kopff, the big talk this week is the storms, and some on the right are asking, whatever happened to global warming?
Well, here's the problem. Actual science is trying to make sense out of a limited bit of information. You come up with a hypothesis, and then you either test it or you see what happens. And for some reason, global warming turned into this moral thing where if you didn't go along with it, you were a bad person. And unfortunately, the universe didn't go along with us and has given us absolutely, standard temperatures for the past 17 years. And right now, we're in the middle of what we constantly hear is a rare polar vortex to remind us that, I don't know what, getting cold is rare? It
right.
isn't. It's just one of the things that happens, and climate changes, but it's not getting especially warmer.
Now, after the weather, a lot of people are talking about Governor Andrew Cuomo's upcoming speech. That'll be heard today in Albany. The governor's going to talk about many things, but one of the big things that was leaked to the New York Times over the weekend was his idea of allowing medical marijuana. The New York Post's Fred Dicker talked about this on his radio show yesterday. Dicker kind of puts the whole thing into perspective from a historical legislative view. Here's what he said.
This marijuana proposal from the governor, look at the fine print. This is Governor Hugh Carey's law. Hugh Carey, when Mario Cuomo was lieutenant governor and David Axelrod was the health commissioner. It was passed in 1980. Tony Olivieri, a very fine individual who I knew, who had run against Mario Cuomo in a three-way primary for lieutenant governor in 1974, had died of brain cancer just months earlier. He had used marijuana and talked about it to alleviate some of his symptoms, or the symptoms from the chemotherapy. This law was passed in 1980. Governor Mario Cuomo had 12 years to implement the law and never did. Neither did Governor Pataki or Governor Carey, Governor Spitzer, Governor Patterson. It's been on the books. It allows a limited number of hospitals, I think they're going to be in New York City, to dispense marijuana for medical purposes under very narrowly constrained justifications. At the time, it was considered a humane law, much as medical marijuana is thought of to this day. But if it was so humane, why didn't they enforce it?
Dr. Kopff, what's the answer?
Well, the question is, if we knew that it would only go to people who are suffering terribly and are helping to alleviate their pain, that would be great. But the fact is, it is not only, as we've seen in Colorado, the first step toward legalizing marijuana, but most of it doesn't go to people that are really sick. In Colorado, when we put in, and we were in the 20 states that have legalized medical marijuana, what happened was an epidemic of glaucoma. That used to be an old person's problem. Suddenly people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s found doctors who would say they needed medical marijuana. All of these places were built. They weren't randomly distributed. There's one right across from the University of Colorado. There are others nearby high schools. It's clear that they're putting these places where it's near children in schools. And again, there's very little glaucoma among those students. There's very little, of the chronic diseases of aging among those kids. It was aimed to be gotten to children.
Dude, I'm feeling that glaucoma coming on.
You can feel it, can't you? Oh, yeah, especially when the tension builds, the stress builds. Oh, my glaucoma gets worse when I'm under stress.
Your thoughts on what's to come for New York legislatively?
Well, if Cuomo is willing to yield on this point, what we found is first you have the medical marijuana and you try to, regulate it pretty strictly toward really sick people. Then, there are people that have other problems. They're nervous when they address a crowd. On and on. So you start spreading it. Before long, you have these places everywhere, and there clearly aren't that many sick people. What we did was go the next stage, and we've just legalized it completely as of this month, just a few days ago. And so now anybody can buy marijuana who's an adult. And the good news is supposed to be we're going to get enormous tax increases from this, some of which will go to schools. Unfortunately, with the students all smoking pot, hard to say how much good that's going to do them. But we haven't yet seen what the cultural effects are, and to that extent, I can't predict New York. I expect that what happens in Colorado will happen in New York. Medical marijuana will lead to generally legalized marijuana, but we don't know what the effect of that will be. We don't know if it'll be basically positive, whether it'll be no, or whether it'll be really damaging.
Pat Buchanan just wrote an article about New York State. He said New York City banned certain cigarettes, but, and this does not go for Governor Cuomo because Cuomo and New York City politicians like Bloomberg are two different situations. But why is it that so many who are into nanny state rules on cigarettes seem to be pro-marijuana?
That's one of the great questions. Just after Labor Day, David Brooks of the New York Times wrote an article questioning the wisdom of legalizing marijuana, and the letters poured into the New York Times, all who said, well, drinking is worse. Well, how is that an argument? Don't we all agree that we have a drinking problem, that car accidents and people's livers and health are affected by this? How is the fact that there's something worse you can do to yourself an argument for doing something else?
Right.
It seems to be a terrible argument, and that every single letter made the same point. And the argument is, I got a headache and had a glass of wine, and I felt better.
Moving on to education issues, Dr. Kopff, Common Core has been a big story out here in the news in upstate New York since school started last fall. I was just looking on Politico.com. It had an article on it about how the Koch brothers were behind the anti-Common Core sentiment in order to cause problems for teachers' unions. I can only tell you that locally, the Tea Party members around here are not the strongest anti-Common Core voices. That theory doesn't really seem to hold water, at least in this part of the country. I was also on the Politico website looking at a video clip of a Wendy Kopp of TFA, that's Teach for America. Wendy Kopp told Politico she cannot understand why there is all this anti-Common Core sentiment out there. Here's what she said about European schools, and I guess a lot of the Common Core is based on the European models.
Go spend a year in three of the either highest performing or fastest improving school systems in the world, Poland, South Korea, and Finland, yes. And it's just fascinating, to see these American students and their experience, and to see each of them essentially come back with the reflection that we're boring our kids to death here. And that there's just something different in these other countries fundamentally about, first of all, the value they place on education, the value kids place on education, and about the fundamental rigor of their experience. I think we need to take that very serious. We're failing our low-income kids, and we're doing a mediocre job at best with our other kids.
Dr. Kopp, that seems to go along with what I've heard locally from the pro-Common Core forces around here. I'm wondering your take on what Wendy Kopp for Teach for America said there.
Well, one, the problem with our school system is the Deweyite model, which is we don't need to teach them grammar and let them express themselves and grow like flowers. And it hasn't worked very well. The countries she's talking about are countries with very common culture, where the schools know exactly what to teach. And we don't have that situation. We have a lot of different cultures and people wanting their own respected, and so the schools end up copying out and just teaching more general ideas. Common Core is a way to salvage the Deweyite model. Most teacher union people I know hate it. Because they think it's just another way of adding more tests, etc. And we've generally argued that what we need is to go back to classical education and put an emphasis on grammar, logic, and rhetoric as the basis of education. And that means it'll be a lot cheaper, a lot fewer subjects to teach, and we wouldn't have to waste our time with these very expensive national programs.
And back to what Politico said on that article, I don't know where they got it that the Koch brothers have any connection to this at all, because what I'm seeing is a lot of angry parents.
What I see are angry parents. I see a lot of either angry or demoralized school teachers. I see administrators confused and not sure what to do. I see the people who support Common Core typically just being sarcastic and dismissive of anybody who opposes them. we're back to this thing which we also discussed with global warming, whereas, if you disagree with me, you're a bad person, and I don't have to answer your problems and your objectives. What most people feel is it isn't clear the Common Core is going to make things better enough to make up for the expense and for the rolling over the local control of schools.
We're talking with Dr. E. Christian Kopff. He's usually our Thursday guest. We're talking to him here on a Wednesday because Congressman Tom Reed requested the time for Thursday. When we get back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. E. Christian Kopff. Back on the Newsmaker Show, I'm Brian O'Neill. On today with Christian Kopff. Again, Christian Kopff, our usual Thursday guest. He's on with us today. It is Wednesday, February the 8th, the day of Governor Cuomo's State of the State speech. We'll hear about that later on today in the news. One thing we've heard a lot about in the news for months now is Obamacare. How are things rolling out in Colorado, and your thoughts on Obamacare?
Well, the problem Obamacare faces, in my opinion, isn't that they can't even set up a website, that they're enrolling loads of sick people but not healthy people, and any insurance scheme needs a mix of both. It's that this country is too big and too diverse for a single plan to work. That's why a plan that's partly based on the states and partly based on businesses and partly based on individual works for us. We're not Finland. It's the same thing with education, by the way. We're not Finland. We're not Singapore. We're not a relatively small area with a relatively unified ethnic and cultural background. We have all different kinds of ethnicities, all kinds of bodies, all different kinds of medical problems, and we need to have different plans for different states, different businesses, and different communities. And I think Obamacare is fundamentally flawed. It isn't a question that they screwed up with the website or that this or that place isn't registering well. It can never handle a country. No single plan can handle a country as big and ethnically diverse as the United States. It is doomed. And the longer it stays around, the more disastrous the collapse will be.
What about this conspiracy theory that's out there that Obama and the administration wanted it to fail?
Well, I wouldn't say that they wanted it to fail so much, but I think that when Obama talked in more or less friendly environments, like the Jon Stewart Daily Show, etc., he often who then complained that he had sold out on the single payer, and on, which he'd supported for years as a state senator and a U.S. senator. He said, look, you're rushing this too fast. You can only move the American people so fast. We'll get there. So, yes, I think he thought that Obamacare would lead to single payer. I don't think he thought it would lead to it because he would drag down the entire insurance industry.
On the topic of Jon Stewart, he's actually one of the more watched, quote-unquote, news shows. It's actually a comedy show, obviously. It's on the Comedy Network. But your thoughts on that and the influence of Stewart politically? A lot of these comedians, I remember in college, a professor saying a lot of these comedians will pose as, hey, I'm just a comedian, and then they'll get their political slant in. Do you think that's what Stewart's up to?
Yes, John is heavily political. He's a commentary show. Then when someone asks him a question, he goes, oh, I'm just joking. I'm just kidding. I didn't mean any of that. The fact is his critiques are often very pointed and very correct. But that isn't really it. I object to this. I once saw Chris Wallace to take him on this point. I thought it was quite well done. He wants to have his cake and eat it, too. He wants to be able to comment on politics, and then when you question him and go back to him, he then says, oh, I was just joking. Oh, can't you take a joke? Come on. And I think it's a sort of cowardly kind of propaganda, frankly.
One thing they've been talking about at the national level, Dr. Kopff, as you know, the new Fed chief.
That Professor Yellen may not be the choice we need in this case, because she's basically promised to continue the massive inflationary policies of her predecessor, which means that everything looks great on Wall Street. But the problem is that this growth of prices on Wall Street is largely bogus. It's based on the fact that there's always money there, and there aren't other places to go with it. And although a lot of people are saying, this is great, buy stocks, it'll only be worth more, There's a famous statement of Ed Stein, Ben Stein's father, who was also an economist, who said, if something can't go on forever, it won't. And one of the things we know is they can't keep on just buying loads and loads of basically putting credit into the marketplace. At some stage, it loses all contact with what the real value of what we're making and what we're growing. At that stage, there's going to be a very serious correction. And the odds are it'll happen this year. Let's see whether or not, can't predict within days or weeks, sometimes not even within a year, that there's likely to be a serious correction, and that means that stocks will lose a lot of value. And that'll be her bad luck to be the one under whom it happened instead of Bernanke, who really began this policy.
Dr. Kopff, it seems that some have a quirky attitude about the first woman this, the first woman that, at least in the media and some in government. I don't know. Having been in math class before, it didn't strike me as anything big that all the girls in class were better math students than I was.
Yeah, well, also there's a problem with the first woman that has to still show she's a real man. So you don't really find the kind of changes you might hope. Margaret Thatcher was the toughest British prime minister since Winston Churchill.
Right.
And that was partly because that was her personality, but it was also because she had to show that she wasn't, just a sissy. And so the same thing, I think Yellen's going to be in very much the same situation. She's not going to be in a situation to really make the changes that need to be made. She's going to continue what Bernanke has done to show that she's one of the boys. And it's going to be the second who will maybe be able to do something useful as a woman.
We're talking with Dr. E. Christian Kopff here on the Newsmakers Show. Of course, the top story this week was the horrible weather. And wondering, Dr. Kopff, your thoughts on how things should go at professional football games. Do you think they should put the domes up?
There's a lot of talk because this weekend was so appalling, and admittedly, even those of us who don't believe in global warming understand that the polar vortex was unusual. So a lot of talk, let's get domes on the buildings, it'll level the playing field, it'll make every game comparable to every other game, we don't have to worry about this. Of course, the other side is saying, wait a second, that's one of the great things about football, is you play in any weather. Football players will often say, this ain't baseball, I'm playing when it rains, things like that. Also, interestingly enough, the bad weather didn't help the home team. In either Philadelphia's case or Green Bay's case, we really expected the poor San Francisco people to be affected by the bad weather. They were very competitive games.
We've been talking with Dr. E. Christian Kopff, University of Colorado. Dr. Kopff, any final thoughts before we go?
Well, my final thoughts is, my best wishes for a Happy New Year to upstate New York, and let's hope both states get warmer.
Dr. Christian Kopff, I want to thank you for joining us on this Wednesday. Normally it's a Thursday, but
it's great to talk to you, Brian. Hello to everybody in upstate. Hello to everybody in upstate. Hello to everybody in upstate.